So welcome back to Stu Structures. I am Mark Stort and we're here for video 4 and the final episode of building the gantry crane, so stay tuned. Alright, so we are back to finish our gantry crane in this episode. I have the motor unit that goes overhead that controls the bucket up and down. I have the bucket to make, and I'm scratch building that because I couldn't find one. And it's taken a little bit of time, so I wanted to make it look like it's real and would really work, not just a couple pieces of plastic hanging down underneath there to replicate something that wouldn't work. And we have the drive wheels that go under the main support legs that let this whole unit go up and down the rails. So that's not a lot, but there's going to be some time have to go into the bucket and the overhead motor unit. So let's just jump into this and get this all finished.
I think the hardest part of this to do is going to be this bucket, and I don't have real good pictures of it. There's this one that you can blow it up a little bit. It does get blurry, but it gives you a little bit of an idea. And there's this one of it sitting on the ground, which I can blow it up to this point and it's not too bad. And I've got a couple of pictures of other buckets I don't have the rights to, so I'm not showing them on here, which have similar construction. So anyway, I decided, well, the bucket can't be too hard, so I'm going to start by building the bucket. So I, figured out the curvature of the bottom and about how big I thought the bucket may be by those, and I drew out these sides to that on a piece of real thin plastic, and I went ahead and cut those out. And it gives me the basic shape of the sides of the buckets. And then I kind of looked at it and I decided on a width, and then I took this flat plastic, and on the curved side I just went ahead and glued it to where the front edge of the bucket would be, and then slowly, as the glues dried in layers, I came back through and glued the whole curvature side of the bucket in place. And it took a little bit of holding down with weights and stuff, but eventually it dried. And then on the back side, I went ahead and added this rectangular piece of square stock to the back side to give me the fully enclosed area of the bucket finished. Now on top of the bucket, where it connects to everything else, there's these 4 arms. So I looked at the bucket and just judged basically the size and drew these out. Now it needs holes, so I decided instead of cutting these out and drilling the holes, it'd be a whole lot easier to drill the holes first and then cut them out. So I drilled these and then cut them out, and just used a knife and kind of shaped everything a little bit. And that they're not bad little arms to go on top, and this will give me the structure on top of the bucket to connect it all together. And I had pre-picked out this piece of dowel which gave me the size of the holes to use in the top of that for the pin that goes across the bucket. And then I glue those arms to the top of the bucket. And one side I put a little piece of styrene before it's as thick as the styrene was for the arms, so it would offset so that they would overlap. Now I need a tall pulley in between those arms, so I don't have any kinds of pulley that would work, so I just drew something to about the size I wanted on that flat plastic and cut 3 pieces out and put a small piece in between 2 large pieces and glued the 3 together. And just, made a basic pulley. Now I did come back after this shot here and used some files and filed it down a little rounder and got both sides of it pretty much even with each other, so it didn't look too bad. And there's several different, round stocks I need to use for this for various things. And here's just a picture of, the bulk round stock that I bought on eBay. It's relatively cheap. But that same piece that I had picked out before will also go through this pulley. So I came back and drilled a hole on this that matches those arms on top of the bucket. And then between the pulley and those arms, there's some gap in there, and I didn't want everything to move back and forth, so I also cut these styrene cylinders to use as spacers in between the arms of the bucket and this pulley, which would go in the middle. And this whole system, once it goes into the bucket here, will allow it to open like a clamshell operation. It'll open and close. Now eventually I'm going to make all this solid so it doesn't open and close. I'm not going to make this operational. I'm not going to get that in depth into it. But basically this gives me the basic bucket structure, in the bottom half of this whole assembly to go together that hangs underneath the unit. Now on top of that, where the cables come down, in the one picture I can see there's a long piece where the cables come down to raise and lower the bucket, and in the center of that is a line that comes down through this center piece here, and then there's a little small pulley in this system above that. And then to attach the cables coming down to lift the whole thing, I just have these stanchion supports. These are made for plastic locomotive bodies, but I just take 2 of those and glue those into that assembly, and that'll be where the 2 of the cables coming down from the overhead will tie into. And then once I glue the assembly into place, I have that whole assembly together. So between that and the bucket, there are cables that connect the pulleys together, but then there are arms that go down from the center down to the bucket itself. So I need to make a bunch of these little small brackets which will connect those arms from the bucket up to that top center support. And they glue back here on the back corners of the bucket. That's what the little notch was in it for. And there's one on either side of the arm. That's why there was 8 of them. So, I go ahead and glue the first ones on the outside edges of that bucket, and then I can lay the pieces in place and give me an idea of the length and the angles for this angle stock that has to glue in between them. And then I just come back and glue that, and that attaches the top piece to the bottom part of the bucket and gives me, most of the whole assembly. Now there is a cable that comes down through and goes between these pulleys, which will be the part that actually opens and closes the bucket, and then the 2 pulleys on top will just raise and lower the bucket. Now the bucket itself also has some extra metal sheeting added to the edges that actually go down and grind against surfaces and actually do the work of the bucket itself. So I just cut paper to wrap these corners with, and it goes up the flat side of the bucket as well as this rounded lower edge of the bucket, and I glue that on, and pretty much that's basically the whole bucket assembly completed at this point. Now I want to start on the motor unit up on top, and I don't have really good pictures of this either, but there's these 2 big rectangular with pitched roof type structures on either side that I guess raise up and down the bucket and open the bucket. And then there's this round small tool chest looking thing at one end of it that goes about halfway across, and it looks like there's a drive system that sticks out with gearboxes that on either end, and that probably runs the motor unit back across the steel beams itself. So that gives me basic ideas of what the structure was. Now underneath of this, the 3 cables that would have went down to the bucket, I need gear or pulleys for, and I know those are going to be on the bottom of the bucket, so I just cut some circles to make pulleys out of and kind of lay those on a square that fits down in between the 2 tracks and figure out an opening in the bottom of this that I can mount 2-3 pulleys inside of. And I cut that out, and then I cut some sides to bring me up to, about track level or so, and go ahead and put this box together as the basis for the bottom end of the whole motor unit. And I got the opening cut here for the pulleys, so I'm going to go ahead and put the pulleys together, and I just mount some of this styrene on the flat stock, and then go ahead and cut it out with the flange, and then turn it over once I get the basic circle cut, and mount the other side of the plastic, and then cut a flange on it to match that side. And I just drill out the centers to a size of a wooden dowel that I have, and just slide them on the wooden dowel. Well, these aren't perfectly matching and all that, and I didn't file everything as clean as I should, but it's going to be up inside and you're really not going to see it much. Now this whole thing needs to be mounted on that bottom, so I cut these 2 flange pieces for either end of that dowel that they're mounted on, and mount them on the dowel, and then I can go ahead and cut the dowel off to length. And then once that's done, that's basically the whole pulley unit that mounts down inside that box. Now before I glue that in there though, I want to go ahead and drill these 4 holes, because this is where the axles will go for the wheels that allow this to run back and forth across the big beams. And once the holes are drilled, I just go ahead and mount this whole pulley assembly up inside that box. And you know, here's just a picture of it from the lower side. This is only part of it that's going to be exposed, and it's going to be underneath, so you're really not going to see it that much anyway, so it's good enough for me. Now the wheels, I'm just going ahead and using some more of that styrene, you know, tubing, and cutting 4 wheels and mounting it on the same as I did the pulleys, you know, with styrene on either side, and cutting it flush with the styrene and drilling holes in the center of it for axles. And then I just mount one side onto an axle and slide it through the hole. And then I try to get my widths right by setting it down in the structure itself and measuring where the other wheel will go, and then mount the other wheel on the other side and glue it into place. Now these are movable at this point, and I probably should have cut the wheels just a little bit more narrow, but for now I'm going to roll with this. And then, you know, the structure on top is actually wider. It's as wide as the beams are. So I'm just on top of that, I'm mounting some styrene, and then building another box up on top of that, where all the motor assemblies and gears and all that type of thing that basically run the upper part of the unit are mounted on. And before I go ahead and mount the rest of that up on top, I'm going ahead and gluing in 3 strings to use as cables to go down to the bucket, and glue them around the pulleys and making sure I have good clearance in the bottom. I did make this opening just a little bit bigger because the cables wouldn't have been rubbing on the sides. Now up on top for the 2 main motor units that control the bucket itself, you know, they're basically these long rectangular boxes, and I'm just making this like I would a small house really, but an HO gauge is just a small motor unit basically, but it's all enclosed inside of a steel casing. And then I kind of put, you know, the top or roof on it, and I just use a file and you know, get all the edges nice and clean on it, and to the point that I can handle them, and go ahead and mount them on this on the top of that. Now I did put a flat sheet on top of that whole unit that I made as a top, and then glued these on top of that. Now the motor unit and the gearboxes that actually drive the assembly itself, I'm going to just make out of this sprue material here. I like using scraps whenever I can. And the bigger screw unit, this gray, when I go ahead and check for a length of what the motor and how well it would have fitted down in between those 2 big boxes up on top, and I just round off either ends. And then for mounts, to be able to mount it on there, I just cut 2 pieces of angle, and what I do is just round out the upper edge of those and then mount them on that, and it creates kind of a propane tank looking thing, but it was probably about the right size for a motor for this unit, and it fits nice down in between those boxes. Now for the gearboxes, I'm just going to use a smaller piece of sprue and cut 2 things that were similar to what the motor unit was, but they're, you know, a little shorter and smaller in diameter than what those were, and round off the ends the same way as I did that other piece, and I have my 2 basic bodies for the gearboxes. Then I just go ahead and mount some, you know, styrene to either ends of them to act as bearings. I put a square piece as a control panel up on top of the motor unit, and the little risers that rise the gearboxes up on either end. I put some drive shafts in between them, and just mount the whole assembly on the drive box itself. Now down on the one end there is another control box or something. I'm not sure what it is, but you know, I just glued 4 pieces of thick styrene together and took a knife and scraped it kind of into a dome shape the way it was, and I'm going to use a file after this picture and clean it off. But I just go ahead and mount that in place, then go ahead and glue the 3 cables down to the bucket unit and make it one unit and put paint on everything. Now the strings are, even though everything's lined up, are wanting to kind of turn on me a little bit, and the bucket isn't staying square, so I'm going to have to play with that a little bit. But, basically that's the whole unit. And when I came back and set it in the tracks, it just didn't want to run right down through there. So I cut the inner, just took my Dremel tool and cut the inner lip off of all that track across there. And now that I set the unit down in there, it rolls back and forth across that nice and clean. So I'm going to come back and paint that. And the whole motor unit and box basically at this point are complete. So that's one more thing off the list of things to do.
So now we need to work on the wheels that go under the main tower supports so this thing can roll up and down tracks. So I found some tubing and just went ahead and cut 4 wheels for this. And I found a couple of gears that used to belong to some small HO scale race cars that I had years ago. And the holes in the center and everything, I think I can use these for the gears for the 2 drive wheels. And the holes in the middle of these are bigger than the dowel I want to use for axles, so I'm just going to glue these to some flat styrene and glue holes in them, and then put the styrene axles through all the assemblies and start gluing the axles and the wheels together. And only one end has the gears on. The other end I just put flanges on so that they'll stay on the rail as it rolls up and down the rail, but that's all 4 axles. Now to hold these axles in place between the plates down at the bottom, I want to cut some little squares with holes drilled in them. So I drill these holes and then cut out the squares that I need to mount inside the flanges down there. And I have a way now to mount those down there, and they'll set in those grooves. And I previously had these 2 side plates mounted underneath the tower, and I got to come back and mount the plates on the other sides, and that gives me the place in between to mount the axles. Now I had to do a little trimming and playing with this, but once I got it all cleaned up, I came back and mounted those little squares in between there, and it gives me a place to spread just a little bit and slip that axle down there, and they'll set right in there just in the way they should. Now I had a little bit of a problem with these moving around, so I just went ahead and glued them in solid so they don't actually turn. But basically that's the whole bottom, maybe then adding some rivet detail to it later on, but that's the whole drive system down at the bottom finished. Now the only thing left on this is this upper cage. I'm not really sure what this was used for. I'm sure it gives support to the brackets up above. It might have been the way to run electric lines down to that motor unit, I'm not sure. But judging by the scale I came up with, I put this drawing together on paper and then went through all my various plastic stuff and found some tubing and angles and iron I-beams and everything that I need to put together the tops. And I boiled some water and then just used some tweezers, and using that paper, I just dip it down in the hot water and make a bend, dip it down in the hot water, make a bend, and come up with the arch pieces for this. And then, the cross bracing is just straight dowel, so I glue one side and then use weights on it and support it and come back and glue the other side. And where these cross members meet the main beams, there's these little support brackets on them as well. So I go ahead and cut a bunch of those, and once I get the 2 cross braces in place, I glue them in the center, but then I put these little plates on the end where they meet the up braces all the way around. Now down at the bottom of these, there's some I-beam glued to the inside, so I glued that on, and then I cut a square plate to go on the bottom of all of that and glued that to that so it'll mount on top of the I-beams and the main structure itself and give me better gluing. So once I have that all ready, then I'm ready to come back and start gluing that to the top of the structure. So I just, grind off a little bit of the paint in the areas where I want this to adhere to and go ahead and glue those in place. Now across the top of those, there's an I-beam that crosses across those, and I want a way to set those angles, the tubing, up on top of those. So I cut a couple of angle iron pieces to glue to the top of that I-beam, and then I just inset them just a little bit where that tubing will come up across and glue them to the I-beam. and then that's ready to mount underneath of the whole cross bracing, and the cage up on top is, you know, what I call it. I'm not sure what it actually called, but it looks kind of like just a work cage of some sort. So once I glue that on there, you know, that's basically about it. Now there's also some angle side bracing on these, and you know, this is I-beam and it's cut and welded on the original, so you know, I found some I-beam that would work for that size, and I just go ahead and cut V-edges out of it, you know, and bend it to where it needs to be bent, and then I have my extra braces. Now, you know, it never fails. It's about the time I got this whole project done, I did find this other picture of another one just about exactly like it at another place in West Virginia, and you know, it looks to be identical to the one I built. But you know, I'm okay with this. That didn't give me a whole lot more of an idea except for some rivets, and I may come back and add more rivet detail to this. It definitely needed a lot more than, you know, what I have on it at this point. But you know, after I put the black paint on everything, it kind of toned down the cage so that even though it's a little large, it doesn't look bad. And you know, I think it's a good representation of what was there in Grafton at the time. So you know, I'm happy with this. I've still got to do the whole unit underneath of it where all this sets onto, but this was the, you know, the hardest part of the whole scenery area was to do this thing right here. So there you have the end of the build of the gantry crane. This was quite an involved build. I was realizing when I had it on the turntable there at the end, there's a couple more support brackets that actually go to that cage on top of everything. And you know, the cage is probably a little taller than it ought to be, but you know, at this point I'm pretty pleased with the whole structure. You know, it's got a few little things in it. I guess we are our own worst critics when it comes to doing anything. In any case, I'm pleased with it. I think it'll look great on the model railroad when I get to build things eventually. It's going to be quite the chore to put together the whole base that this thing mounts on, because there's a lot of tracks that are suspended on concrete with open areas below them. And you know, anyway, it's going to be kind of a complicated build just putting the whole thing together that this all sets on. But in any case, thank you for coming back and sharing this time with me. I do appreciate it. Like and share my videos and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos come out. We've got a lot more builds coming on. I've got a lot of things, a few little other extras to throw in here and there along the way. And you know, I think I'm about ready to the point to begin another big build again. I do have a couple of complicated builds, and I'm not sure which one I want to get into at this point. So keep in touch with me and keep coming back and watching, and we'll see what we get into next. And you know, just drag out your trains and play around, and happy model railroading.